Well, let's introduce Professor Christobel Saunders, who is a consultant surgeon at the Royal Perth, Fiona Stanley and St John of God Subiaco hospitals in Western Australia. She's also a board director at Breast Cancer Trials, and she's coming to us from Perth tonight. So, hi, Christobel.
Oh, hi, Anna, and hello to everybody. Lovely to have you all here. Well, I've been asked to talk first a little bit about a clinical trial that we're running, which is actually not about a drug. It's about a diagnostic, that is MRI for breasts. But before that, I've been asked to just tell you a little bit about what clinical trials are and where they come from and why they're important. So I'll try and do that by advancing my slides, which is not happening. There we are. So clinical trials, why are they so important? You've heard a lot from Leslie about how important they have been, and also the stories from the other ladies that we heard in the beginning. But I just thought I'd take you back to a bit of history because I think this is fascinating. Now, you're probably all aware that it was around the sort of 1500s that Europeans started to explore the world, for conquest and trade, and the East India Company was coming up. And yet these very long voyages, about 50% of people by the time they arrived on the ships would die. And of course, that's what they were dying from, was largely from scurvy, from lack of vitamin C. And people had no idea why this was. And along came a British naval surgeon called James Lind in 1753, and he did what could be described as the first ever clinical trial. Now, I don't know if it's a drug trial or if it's what it is, but this is actually from his journals, which I've actually seen in the Royal College of Surgeons in England. And he said, on the 20th of May, 1747, I took 12 patients with scurvy on the ship the Salisbury, very similar, and he gave 2 of them a quart of cider, 2 others elixir vitriol, 2 had vinegar, 2 of the poor fellows got seawater, 2 of them got oranges and lemons, and then 2 had nutmeg. And the consequences were sudden and most visible from the use of oranges and lemons. Now, I don't know if N equals 2 is a clinical trial that we would do anymore, and Sarah Jane's going to talk a little bit more about drug trials, but it's fascinating to think that that's where it all started. But why do we do them nowadays? And I've just shown you the picture up there of this poor lady who had used an alternative treatment for her breast cancer. She was actually using black salve, which burns away at the tumour. And a lot of people will read anecdotes and think because somebody else has said this has worked, that it does work. But of course, we know that the only way you can really tell if a treatment is working is to put it in a study. And you heard about those studies, for example, of Herceptin, where half the patients actually receive the drug treatment, but half actually get a placebo or get standard of care. And the diagrams I've shown you on the other side of the picture here are the remarkable results that we get when we see large numbers of patients, in this case women with breast cancer, going into studies of, in this case, drug treatments. And you can clearly show, if you randomize them to have conventional treatment or a new treatment, whether or not you can actually improve survival. And you can see here these rather crude graphs show you that by using drugs, in this case endocrine therapy drugs such as tamoxifen, we can show clear evidence right out at 10 and more years that more women are surviving who use these drugs. And this is really the only way that we can positively and scientifically show this. So I said in the bottom that, most innovations in medical treatment do arise in the lab, as Leslie said, in the test tube or in animal experiments. But it would be very foolish to translate those very early studies straight into medical practice without careful controlled development. And that careful controlled development is exactly what a trial is. Now, I'll go back to talking about the trial that I've been asked to briefly introduce you to, and we call it the MRI trial. And I'll tell you how this came about. Now, we knew that in practice in Australia and New Zealand and many other countries, about 20% of women who were newly diagnosed with breast cancer were being recommended to have an MRI. And that's really to help us, the surgeons, but also the oncologists and the radiation oncologists plan what the best treatment is and give women confidence that they could understand how big their tumour was, whether their tumour was in more than one area of the breast. And we knew that this was particularly important for some women who were very young and had very dense breast tissue on mammograms. It was often difficult to see the extent of tumour. Or women where we thought perhaps the clinical size of the tumour was bigger than what we could see on the X-ray, to try and really understand it, because we believed, and there was some evidence to show, that MRI was the most accurate way of looking at breasts, at least for some women. and yet it wasn't funded by the government. And women were paying between $600 and $3,000 for an MRI, hugely out of pocket. So it took us a number of years, but eventually we convinced the government to give us a temporary Medicare item number which would fund MRI in this setting. But they said to us, well, we're only going to fund it if you can prove how useful it is. So the government did give us some funding through something called the Medical Research Futures Fund for a project which, and this is part of the project, this clinical trial, to really see how useful MRI is in decision making, how it actually changes women's pathway of care, whether both the doctors and indeed the patients feel more comfortable having had this test to help point the pathway of treatment. And most importantly for the government, I guess, is it cost effective? So this is the study that we're doing. And these are schemas. This is a complex thing, but this is what we show when, if you join Leslie's group, this is the sort of thing that Leslie's group is looking at all the time, these trial schemas. So essentially what we're looking at is women with any cancer that's localized to the breast. If their treating team feels that an MRI may be useful to help guide treatment. So interestingly, this isn't a randomized trial. You're not being randomized to an MRI or not. It's if the treating team feel an MRI would be useful to help guide treatment, whether the patient can undergo breast-conserving surgery or lumpectomy, or indeed a mastectomy may be more useful, or whether the patient should have chemotherapy up front, for example. It is more useful, we often find, in younger women, in women with a certain breast cancer type called lobular cancer, and in women with those very dense breasts on mammograms where it's very difficult to see the extent of a tumour. If the patient agrees to consider this, we give them information on the trial, consent them into the trial. We then complete, which we think is a really important part, something we call patient-reported outcome measures, or PROMs. And these are really asking a woman about how she feels about her treatment, what her quality of life is like, and also how her treatment may affect the decisions that she makes, how the MRI may affect the decisions she makes around treatment. We then record what a plan would have been without an MRI. We undertake the MRI, then that helps inform the clinical management, and we go on to register what eventual treatment the woman will undergo. And long term, we also ask more of these patient-reported outcome measures. And interestingly, for breast cancer trials, we're now doing this actually on the smartphones. You'll receive some questionnaires on your smartphone or other device if you're able to. And we're collecting that data and also, as I say, doing an important health economic analysis. Now, this trial is being run at fairly limited sites because we have to ensure the quality of the MRI that's going on, as well as being able to ensure that all of the researchers understand how we're doing this. So these are the sites spread across the country in Perth, in Sydney, and in Melbourne. And we're doing very well, we think. We only started towards the end of last year. I think COVID slowed everything down for everybody, especially in places like Victoria, but we're on target. We're certainly hoping that by the middle of next year, we'll have accrued the number of ladies we need, which is around 400 ladies for this trial, and that we'll be able to report back to the government. And if all goes well, we will be able to get this item number forever, and everybody who needs it will be able to afford to have an MRI, and it will be paid for. So that will be the great outcome if we can show this will work. So thank you, and happy to take any questions.
That would be a great outcome, Christobel. I just noticed too that your background doesn't really look like Perth.
No, it isn't. And although interesting, the great thing about living in WA is we do have some magnificent places to travel to, and we've recently been to Cocos and Christmas Island. So yes, it's a little bit of Cocos and Keeling Islands in the background.
Nice. You touched on it a little bit there about what impact has COVID-19 had on the conduct of clinical trials. What have you seen over the last year, and has it improved in Australia and New Zealand?
Well, initially it had enormous impact, of course. For many clinical trials, the patients had to stop. So many clinical trials were put on hold for a while, and that was for a variety of reasons. Either patients couldn't come in for elective surgery, there was a lot more telehealth, which made it difficult. New trials weren't being opened. We were much less affected in Australia than our counterparts in many other places in the world. But I guess what it did do is it forced us to adapt. We started to learn how to do teletrials. We started to be able to ring patients up and get information. As I say, doing these electronic collection of data was a great thing, which we've been able to pioneer. And I think we're more or less all back on track now. It also just made simple things like for a while people couldn't go into their labs, they couldn't go into their research buildings. It varied in each state. Of course, here in Fortress WA, we were a little bit easier to still get in, but nevertheless, many researchers work within a university environment. Universities closed, and for the patients, they were worried about coming into hospital. And some treatments were changed. Treatment regimens were changed. So it made a huge difference. But I think we're getting out of it now.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've got several questions that have come through. One is from Teresa, and Teresa has asked, what is the current information on best screening tools for dense breasts?
Well, that's a good one. And I did mention breast density and MRI. And the honest truth is I can't tell you that for sure yet. It is subject to an enormous amount of research and discussion and trying to find out. Essentially, breast density means the sort of white area on a mammogram. And we know that there's two problems with breast density. And breast density affects about 25% of women will have moderately or reasonably dense breasts. And that's something that can occur, it's something pre-programmed through life. So younger women have dense breasts, but women who have very dense breasts will always have very dense breasts, even when they're older. And the two problems with breast density are that, one, it's very difficult to see things on the mammogram because cancers are white, and if the mammogram is very white, it's hard to pick it up. And the second problem is that breast density itself is an increased risk factor for developing breast cancer. So it's a sort of double whammy. Now, we can only really pick it up on a mammogram. It's not something you can feel. And WA is the only state at the moment that our breast screen program reports back to women that they have dense breasts. So there's a variety of reasons why other states don't at the moment. But you may have a mammogram done elsewhere and you may be told that you have a dense breast. And usually the information then is to go and talk to your GP. Sadly, most GPs probably don't know what to do. So we recommend that if a woman does have a dense breast, she should certainly perhaps consider having a clinical breast examination by a GP or a specialist, and that probably consider at the moment to have an ultrasound. There has been one large study in Europe called the DENT study, which has shown benefit of MRI, but at the moment MRI is a complex test. It's got a lot of downsides as well, so we wouldn't routinely use an MR for a dense breast, but an additional ultrasound may be useful. There's also, just briefly, there's also something called molecular breast imaging, which some people may have heard of. The jury's still out about how useful that may be, but it could be.
Right, okay. Well, there's a question from Lee who wants to know whether you're seeing more people become interested in participating in clinical trials, and are more people understanding what trials are. Although I guess it's really quite in the air with COVID.
Yeah, I think people are much more understanding with COVID about science generally and about the importance of medicine and new treatments. And so generally people are very interested in trials. And I think the nice thing about the portfolio of trials that we have at Breast Cancer Trials is that they do cover the breadth of different treatments and different types of treatments. So there are trials not just about new drugs and things such as Sarah Jane may be telling you about, but new diagnostics, which Sarah Jane will also tell you a bit about. Things like MRI, there's trials of new radiotherapy techniques, for example, and even trials in physiotherapy or supportive care. So they really do range across all modalities of treatment and at different times in the patient's journey, right from diagnosis right through to treatments when a patient sadly has disease that's spread.
Well, there's a question from Bryony who asks, what is the youngest age that you can participate in a clinical trial?
There isn't one really, but all trial protocols will have an age on them. So it kind of depends on what the trial is of and the disease. Clearly, in cancer can affect, not breast cancer, but many cancers can affect children. And for childhood cancer, nearly every child with cancer will be in a clinical trial. They have had the most phenomenal success with clinical trials. And it's really translated into the fact that survival from childhood cancer has increased enormously, and that's as a result of going into clinical trials. For most breast cancer trials, it will be over 18 because breast cancer very rarely occurs under that, but it will depend a little bit on what the actual trial is about.
All right, Christobel, there's a final question for you from Sandra, and Sandra has asked, do you think there will ever be a cure for breast cancer that does not involve radiation or chemotherapy?
Oh, well, that's a difficult thing. I mean, I'm a surgeon and, you know, I use a knife to cut cancers out. And the honest truth is, actually, a large proportion of breast cancers are actually cured by surgical removal. The trouble is we don't always know which ones. And so the benefit of giving other treatments after surgery is really that in case they may come back. But we often don't know that, which is why we're constantly looking for tests that may be able to tell us which cancer is more likely to come back and therefore which patients have been cured by surgery and which patients need other treatments.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Christobel. That was really informative. We appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.